seen the headlines. Earlier this month, Johns Hopkins University, one of the world's leading medical research institutions, came under fire for releasing an online glossary of LGBTQ terms and identities, in which it defined lesbians as non-men attracted to non-men. As Western society deplatforms and ridicules women, Kathleen Stock is that rare, erudite voice, posing questions, researching, and engaging in dialogue across boundaries. Why does reality matter for feminism? How might trans rights activists and feminists productively collaborate? What might a positive vision of our future really look like? A former professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex, Kathleen is a prolific writer and author. She resigned from her university lectureship after being repeatedly harassed on campus. Remarkably, she has refused to submit to today's reigning orthodoxy, most recently participating in a viral Q&A at the Oxford Union. This evening, Kathleen's lecture is titled Feminism Between the Right and the Left, and there will be time for questions afterwards. Please join me in welcoming Kathleen Stock to the stage.
Thank you. Thank you very much for having me. I'm delighted to be here. I was just thinking, I've had some tough gigs in my life, but I've never literally followed a rock star before, so but here I am, so you'll have to put up with this. So what I want to talk about is the crisis in feminism. Now, some of you may not be feminist. You may think that's fine, but I am a feminist. And I think there's a crisis in feminism posed by what I think of as gender ideology. So I do want to talk a bit about that, or mostly about that. But I will give you some background on me for those of you that don't know me. So as Audrey's just said, I was a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex for 18 years in the UK. And for a lot of the time, I focused on fiction and the nature of fiction philosophically and the nature of imagination. So I would ask and research questions like what kinds of mental states are imaginings, what is pretense, what are fictions, and what is their relationship to reality, and how does fiction get involved in our daily life, basically. But at the same time, I considered myself a feminist. I didn't think very hard about what that meant. I thought that it was being taken care of by other people, and I trusted them. And occasionally I would give talks under the guise of feminist philosophy, most at the time about specific issues like sexual objectification, for instance. But I mainly assumed mainstream feminism was on the right track. Around 2015, I started to become aware of something called gender ideology, genderism, transactivism. And I started to notice that institutions and organizations in the UK and across the English-speaking world and in Europe were talking as if changing your sex was a literal possibility, either through sex or hormones, but even more bizarrely to me, through just saying things. You could change your sex. You could become a woman just by saying, I'm a woman, even if you were male, what I would call male. So this is the idea, the background set of ideas here is around this quasi-philosophical idea of gender identity and the idea that we all have one. We all have a gender identity inside us. And some people have a gender identity which is incongruent with their sex, their biological sex, or the sex assigned at birth, as the terminology goes. And it's supposed to be gender identity, not biological sex, that makes you a woman, a man, or neither, if you're non-binary. And the only person that knows your gender identity is you, so it's inside you, kind of, and it bursts out your chest one day, and you say, I'm a woman, or I'm a man, or I'm not. And then at that point, you have to be affirmed. So everyone has to say, yes, you are. And that's the official policy of lots of professional organizations, including medical and psychological ones these days. So that has given rise, that set of background sort of pseudo-philosophical ideas has given rise to policies, actual policies in workplaces and hospitals and prisons and schools and universities, as you probably know. So it's given rise to a set of policies about legal certification. So a male can walk into place that issues legal sex changes and say, I'm a woman, and get a certificate that says they are a woman. But also, even if you don't have a certificate, a lot of the policies in Britain have been rewritten so you can go into women's changing rooms or dormitories, or if you're convicted of a crime, you can be put in a women's prison simply on the basis of self-ID, this idea of what you say. So this is not surgery, it's not hormones, you don't have to physically change your body at all. It's an inner state that has determined your reality in some way. And I thought there were a lot of problems with that, and there are, for women and for children mostly, but also for men, actually. It's not that great for them either. But really, it is terrible for women, and it's terrible for children who don't understand these concepts and misapply them in various ways. I thought that it was a fiction that you could change sex, and I thought that this whole thing must be a fiction, that we were immersing ourselves in the fiction of sex change. We were going along with the idea, as if we were in a role play, that this person is a woman, or this person is a man, or this person is neither a woman nor a man. And from my background in the philosophy of fiction, it made most sense to me to understand those statements as participating in a fiction, which might be a good idea in certain limited circumstances. Therapeutically, it might be a good idea. Engaging in fictions can be genuinely rewarding and creative and exciting, but I thought it was important that we kept the distinction between the fiction and the reality, and that sometimes the reality is the most important thing. And I certainly thought it was dangerous for societies to compel citizens to immerse themselves in these fictions, and I saw that people were being compelled. So we're increasingly told that anyone who doesn't accept all of those ideas that I just told you is transphobic, and there should be no debate. There used to be a hashtag in sort of 2018, hashtag no debate, trans women are women, hashtag no debate. Because debate is immoral and it exposes trans people to harm. So you're questioning their existence. These are the things that are said, so you can't do any of that. You just have to affirm, affirm, affirm. So I just thought that this was all nonsense. And I thought it was philosophically, it made no sense. And I also realized that philosophy was being brought in the background to kind of prop this stuff up, bad philosophy. So the idea that biological sex is a spectrum rather than a binary, based on ideas from people like Anne Fausto Sterling, if you've ever heard of her, or Judith Butler, or the idea, indeed, that there is a mysterious inner gender identity, a bit like a soul. So there's a lot of Christian or Cartesian dualist kind of ideas floating around here that are being re-expressed through these kinds of ideas. They look modern, but actually they're quite old, I think, in some ways. So I was trained as a philosopher to critique these ideas, and I knew there was a lot wrong with them, and I could see that they were going to have terrible effects on, for instance, vulnerable, abused women in prison having to share their dormitories and showers with male rapists, which is happening in several countries, including the UK. And there was a third reason for my interest, which is that I was and am a non-man attracted to a non-men. In other words, I'm a lesbian. So I am part of the so-called LGBT community, which is not really a community, in whose name these ideas are being advanced. And that gave me an interest as well. So I started to speak out in public. I eventually wrote a book. Along the way, I encountered an enormous amount of hostility, which you can read about if you Google my name. And I ended up having to leave my academic job at Sussex University. And that's part of the reason I ended up here, which I'm very happy about. So that's the background. And I'm not going to do a kind of rabble-rousing speech about how all of that is really terrible, because I kind of think it's so obviously terrible that it doesn't really need an enormous amount of intellectual effort to say what's terrible about it. But what I do want to do is consider, in an open-minded way, what this means for feminism. So I understand, not everyone's a feminist, and certainly I don't mind if people say to me, I think feminism is terrible. I think that's an opinion, there's a safe space for that sort of opinion. But as I say, I am a feminist, and I became aware about the same time that I became aware of gender ideology that the word feminism was being used in new ways that I didn't understand. So, and it was being used by people who were calling themselves feminists. So feminists were saying, they were agreeing with gender identity ideology. They were saying any man who calls himself a woman is a woman. In fact, some feminists were like the biggest cheerleaders for this stuff. And they said it was a feminist conclusion. It was part of feminism to deconstruct the binaries of sex by saying that men can be women. And equally, some feminists, or so-called feminists, were pushing for desexing language, saying we should stop saying that only women can get pregnant, or only women can have periods, or go through the menopause, because these are things that can happen to men, and they can also happen to non-binary people. And you see across institutions in the UK that the word woman and the word female are being removed from policies all over the place. So menopause policies in workplaces talk about menopause as happening to people, and pregnancy happening to people, and sexual assault happening to people. And I thought, well, there's a certain kind of person that this actually happens to. But we don't mention that anymore. Or we replace that with sometimes with words like womb haver or cervix owner, as if those are supposed to be better. And feminism has also been redefined, I noticed, as now it's for everyone. So feminism is for everyone is to me, a weird slogan that you hear, because I think, well, no, it's not. It's a political movement for women and girls. That's basically what it always was. You may think it's a doomed project, but that is what it was. So it's a bit strange to say that feminism is now for everyone. And I thought, well, if you lose the meaning of the word woman, which you seem to be doing, I just don't see how that doesn't make feminism collapse in on itself as a coherent project, and maybe that's what, in fact, was happening. So basically, my reflections on gender identity ideology and transactivism made me question feminism, what it was for, who it was for, what its limits were, and how we'd got here. So I want to, I guess I want to rehearse two possible framings of how we've got here. And one of them I think is definitely wrong, and then the other one I'm not sure about. So and then I'd be interested to hear what you think. So one thing I've noticed is that reputationally, the transactivist agenda is killing the reputation of feminism in some conservative circles. If it ever had a good reputation there anyway, it is, absolutely hammering it dead. So here's one relatively crude way, I think, of politically framing the relationship between feminism and transactivism. And I'll call this it's all the fault of feminism and the left framing. So it goes roughly like this. It's very crude. On the right of the political spectrum, there are the conservatives, and these are the people who reject both feminism and gender ideology. So these are the sensible people. And then on the political left, there are the crazy people who embrace feminism, among other nonsense doctrines, and feminism has embraced gender ideology. So on this framing, gender ideology is the fault of feminism, and feminism is the fault of the left, and there's no credible version of the left or of feminism that stands against gender ideology. So it's all intertwined. And I think of this as roughly the framing of people like Matt Walsh, who just clearly have no time for feminism or any time for gender ideology, and they think a plague on both your houses. So I think that some adherence to that kind of framing, conservative, sensible, anti-feminist, anti-gender, left, feminist, pro-gender, crazy, they would say feminism of the past is the reason we have gender ideology now, I think they would say. Because they would say it's feminists from the 1960s that started to minimize the differences between the sexes, the biological sexes, and they started to treat natural biological difference as if it was socially constructed, totally socially constructed. So they introduced the distinction between sex, biological sex, and gender, by which they meant culturally variable, socially constructed notions of masculinity and femininity that vary from place to place and time to time. What you wear, how you walk, what activities you do, that's all cultural. And feminists of the past were very interested in the cultural because they thought they could change it more progressively. So they would call the cultural differences masculinity and femininity, and they would think they had nothing to do with biology. So on this crude framing, gender ideology has sort of continued the project of feminism because it's continued to minimize natural sexual differences to the point at which they're just denied, there aren't any, or they're just, everything is cultural, there's nothing natural anymore. And it's true that gender ideology does treat biological sex as completely culturally constructed, basically, because of the influence of people like Judith Butler, who thinks there's nothing natural before language. Language constructs everything. Social life constructs everything. So on this framing, we can't expect feminism to offer any kind of principled pushback to transactivism, because the two are just too deeply intertwined historically and politically now. Okay, so what does this framing get right? I think it gets a couple of things right. Because it's obviously true that historically feminism has downplayed natural sexual difference, some bits of it have, and emphasized cultural differences between men and women. And it's probably true, I think, or almost definitely true, that some feminists have mistaken some natural differences for cultural ones. Now, I'm sure that there's plenty of examples you could come up with where you think, oh, that's clearly a natural difference, not a cultural one. But I want to sort of take a slightly oblique example. My example is what are called gender abolitionists amongst feminists. So they think you could get rid of all cultural differences between men and women, and they want to. So their sort of progressive project is to eliminate masculinity and femininity, and there just wouldn't be any special way culturally that men behaved or that women behaved that was different. We'd just be people in this view somehow. I mean, I find it very hard to imagine how this could possibly work. But it's a kind of utopian perspective where all cultural differences between men and women have been erased somehow. Now, I think that's crazy, because I think that naturally humans are cultural beings. Like, we cannot stop proliferating culture. And of course, women are going to develop different cultures to men, because women give birth, they get pregnant, they have a whole different set of life events in their cycle, most of them, to men. So there will be different cultural aspects that will just naturally get generated around female life that will be different from male life. And that's a natural feature of us. We are the kinds of social animals, because I think we are animals, that produce culture. Okay, so just to recap that then, so I think that it's true that feminists have overemphasized the cultural at the expense of the natural. And another thing I think that this all the fault of feminism framing gets right is that transactivism has definitely stolen some of feminists' political strategies in a way that's coming back to haunt us. So feminism has often had a loose relationship to truth and evidence and rationality. And actually there's been a whole feminist project of undermining science as seeing it as male created and therefore detrimental to women. So there's a tendency to either cast doubt on science, on biology, for instance, or on social science research, or to selectively cherry pick what works and ignore what doesn't in the service of some kind of political agenda. That's definitely what transactivists are now doing, back to us. And there's also in feminism, I think, an overly pernickety emphasis on language, constantly getting everybody to change their words. That's been going on for decades. You've got to have the right words, they're not to be sexist, and language is almost seen as kind of, if you change language, you're seen as doing something politically very significant, much more significant than if you did something economically, different, and that seems crazy to me too. Still, I think those are the things I think that framing, that crude framing, gets right. But here's what I think it gets wrong. So this is where I move towards a better framing, I think. So it's not true that gender ideology historically is the preserve of the left. And I know it's hard, maybe hard to see that here, but in the UK, it was Conservative governments that brought in all of those policy changes. And they brought self-ID in. I mean, we haven't had a Labour government for years, and it's really in every institution under Conservative governments, successive Conservative governments. And even now, there are several UK Conservative politicians who argue for gender ideology, completely support it. So it's not, this left-right split doesn't work quite as well. And another problem, I think, is with this idea that it's the preserve of the left, not the right, is how corporate-friendly it is. And you can see that by how it's been so thoroughly embraced by HR departments. It's the easiest thing in the world for big business to get on board with, the pride flags, the parades, the putting your pronouns in your bio or whatever it is. But if it was really that radically socialist or left, I just find it hard to see how it would fit so seamlessly into big business and American corporate life and UK corporate life. Now, a further complicating factor is that in the UK, much of the resistance, the grassroots women's resistance to this stuff, we're called Turf Island, people call us Turf Island, but it's basically because we've got loads of grassroots groups who've sprung up to organize meetings where we can discuss this stuff and freely talk about it. And they've mostly come from the left. They've come from the trade union movement because they had the background in organizing, politically organizing, that the right doesn't have. And it's also, the resistance has also come from the women's sector, that is people working in domestic violence refuges or rape crisis shelters. So there's a kind of, there's left-wing people involved, very heavily involved in fighting this stuff, because they've been particularly horrified by the idea that men can just walk into rape crisis shelters and say, I'm a woman, and have access to traumatized people. So, of course, feminism is a highly contested concept. It's just not true, though, that they've all capitulated. And it's not true that the left has all capitulated. And it's not true that the right hasn't. Some of the right has. So in light of those problems, I think we need a different framing from right is good, sane, and against it all, and the left is bad, insane, and for it all. But at the same time, there's something going on here. We need to work out what it is. Okay, so now I'm going to move to better framing, I think, although I'm still a bit hesitant about it. So this is what I will call the it's all the fault of liberals, or it's all the fault of liberalism framing. And on this framing, which I think is a very interesting one, and I'll have more to say about it in a minute, gender ideology is an offshoot or some kind of corrupt product of liberalism. It's like liberalism on crack. Something's gone wrong. And by liberalism, I mean the classical liberalism that many people here are probably attracted to, the hugely influential political doctrine with origins in the Enlightenment and the West, and has dominated Anglo-American and European institutions for centuries. Now, classical liberalism, as you know, I'm sure, has many internal disagreements and varieties, but for the sake of argument, I'm going to pretend that I can condense down its main commitments in 2 minutes. So I would say its central commitments are, metaphysically speaking, humans are to be understood as individuals. So they're not like part of communities first and individuals second. They're individuals first who then can choose to join a community or not join a community. So liberalism is committed to individualism. They think of humans as primarily rational or primarily willing. They have free will, and that is a really important value in liberalism, freedom to rationally reflect on what the good life is and then to follow your own dream and not to be compelled into someone else's dream. And for liberalism, freedom, whatever that means, is the ultimate good or one of the very top goods in life for humans. And there's also a big emphasis on rationality, so seeking moral progress through the application of rationality, also technological process through the application of rationality. So we're supposed to be on this arc, the arc of moral progress is bending towards justice or whatever it is. Okay, now, the point to recognize about this is that liberalism is big on the right and the left. It just expresses itself in different ways. So on the right, the emphasis is mostly on economic freedom, a focus on market freedom, free trade, unrestrained capitalism, the best means of securing a society where individuals can pursue their own goods is letting the markets decide and not governments. But on the left, liberals aren't so much concerned with that. They're more concerned with the idea of breaking traditions and cultural norms and seeing kind of traditional old ways as impediments to your freedom. So, gay marriage, marriage shouldn't just be for heterosexuals. Let's break that down and now let's have gay marriage, or the family is some kind of impediment. The nuclear family is some kind of impediment to some people's freedom, so they need to create their own kind of family. So break that all apart, because that's all seen as some kind of obstacle to your personal freedom, potentially anyway. So in that context, gender ideology is presented as a bizarre sort of corruption of some of those ideas. So it's a corruption that's now spreading like a meme through the population, and it seems very attractive because it pulls on these old liberal tropes about freedom and individualism and being yourself and who you really are, and stuff like that. So, for instance, gender ideology employs the idea of your inner gender identity, the person you really are, and you need self-realization. Never mind about the community around you, never mind about your family, never mind about your relations with other people. It's about as individualistic as it gets. It's like, this is me, you have to accept me, and you have to see me the way I want you to see me. So it's like nothing about social identity or physical identity is relevant, it's just how you feel inside. And there's also the idea that your physical body is potentially an obstacle to your freedom. So it's not just the cultural norms and traditions around you, it's your actual body could be an obstacle to your own freedom. And you should be free to change it, to surgically alter it. And that's obviously propped up with some sort of capitalistic idea that you should be able to buy whatever cosmetic surgery you want. If I want to change my face, I can change my face or my body in any way I want. So if that's the analysis, if that's the basic analysis, that it's liberalism, at least some kind of corruption or extreme weird version of liberalism, that's the problem, and that has kind of caused us to start thinking of ourselves in these strange ways, then it's more complicated. The framing that I offered you earlier is more complicated than, or at least we've got a better one than the last one, because there are various branches of feminism, and one of them is liberal feminism. So liberal feminism is become a bit of a caricature. It's become known as choice feminism, but basically the idea is if a woman wants to do it, she should be able to do it. Or a woman should be able to do whatever a man can do. If the woman wants to work, she can choose to do that. If she wants to stay at home, she can choose to do that. If she wants to have a baby, she can choose to do that. If she doesn't, right, 10 minutes, okay. So if gender ideology is an extension of any branch of feminism, I think it's more like liberal feminism. You should have if you want to change your body, you should. If you want to be who you want to be, you should. If you want other people to call you some name, you should be able to do that. So this leaves room for a critique from both the left and the right, because this liberalism is in the left and the right already, so it complicates this story. So in the last 10 minutes, I'm going to quickly summarize two different approaches to feminism coming out of this, one from the left, one from the right, both of which reject gender ideology, and both of which call themselves feminist. So on the left, we've got something like radical feminism, which takes inspiration from second wave, people like Shulamith Firestone, Kate Millett, Andrea Dworkin, and so on. Now, radical feminists, I think, are more naturally see themselves as on the left than the right, although they might deny that now because they're so fed up with the left. But in that case, they tend to say that they're politically homeless. They put an emphasis on the biological as the kind of substrata of culture, and of feminine culture and masculine culture, as before. And in that emphasis on biology, they're in good company with Marx, for instance, who really insisted that there were biological facts about human beings. These feminists are likely to emphasize sexual dimorphism. Men are bigger, stronger, faster, on average, than women. And they are likely to emphasize the reproductive differences between men and women because they think that those biological differences are the source of women's oppression by men. So they think that biological differences between males and females in the human species give rise to the capacity of men to physically dominate women, to sexually assault them, and it also gives rise to what they would think of as men's exploitative relationship with women's reproductive labor. That is, the using of women for sexual pleasure, the using of women to produce their babies and to raise their babies and to look after the entire domestic sphere, the keeping of women in the domestic sphere. All of that, they think, serves men and their interests economically and practically. So these feminists are likely to be against all forms of female exploitation based on their biological status, and they're critical of the capitalist commodification of the body. They're against prostitution, pornography, commercial surrogacy, sexual objectification of the body. All of that, they think of that as deeply exploitative to women, but it's all based on an acknowledgement of the difference, the biological differences between men and women. Some of them are also against heterosexual marriage because they think that that's exploitative too. They will certainly reject the idea of choice feminism, that if a woman wants to be a prostitute, she should be free to be a prostitute. They think prostitution is terrible whether or not you want to do it. It's still terrible. So they don't think, they think there are preferences that you develop in a patriarchal society that are bad for you. And they're very critical of equality narratives as well, from liberal feminism about like making everything the same, because they think, well, we're not the same, we're different, physically different. Okay, so I think you can probably see, and I'm just not going to labor the point, but there's obviously a reference to biology in that worldview that you can't get rid of. The whole structure depends on there being differences there, and it's part of their theory. So they will reject gender ideology on that basis. They will say gender ideology erases biological difference, erases all the forms of exploitation of women based on biological difference, and they think of it as gender ideology as basically misogynist because it sexually objectifies women and it makes womanhood into a costume, like to be worn by men, a feminized costume to be worn by men. So there is room on the left, I think, for a feminism that does not embrace gender ideology. But what about the right? Okay, is there any room on the right for feminism? I think that's the question. And there are now thinkers like Mary Harrington or Louise Perry, or Catholic feminists like Erika Bachiochi and Abigail Favale, they've all written books. They think of themselves, I think, on the right. They totally reject gender ideology, but they take a kind of different perspective on some of these issues. So they all agree that there's misogyny in the world and exploitation of women. So they agree with the radical feminists about that. They think there should be a women's movement to counter the exploitation of women. And they have other commonalities with radical feminists too. So they emphasize sexual difference. They are critical of equality narratives, which disguise sexual difference. They're critical of capitalism. They're critical of the commodification of women's bodies. They're critical of prostitution, pornography, commercial surrogacy, all of that. So they share that with the radical feminists. And they also think of the norms of male sexual behavior as being bad for women. So this is where they start to come apart from the radical feminists. But they're very critical of the sexual revolution of the 1960s because they think it had a totally detrimental effect on women's sexuality. So the pill basically allowed, according to them, women to start having the kind of sex that men wanted from them, which was commitment-free, promiscuous and involved whatever kinks the men were into. And they think this was not good for women. They think there's biological reasons why it's not that good for women, and they don't like it. Abortion, they think, also freed up both men and women from the consequences of sex and produced widespread cultural changes in sexual behavior that were neither good for men nor women. And unlike radical feminists, these women are very sympathetic towards the traditional heterosexual family because they think that marriage is a way for women to exist in relation to men and to children in a non-commodified, non-capitalist relational way, like a caring, nurturing relationship that doesn't involve transaction. Whereas liberalism is sort of forcing us into a position eventually where everything's transactional, they would say. So that's racing through this, but that's the left and the right, and both of them putting up resistance to gender ideology, and both of them are calling themselves feminists. So I'm just going to finish by making some kind of half-assed observations. I mean, I was thinking about this today, and I was thinking, is there any sort of neat way of framing this? And I think, so here's what I could try. So gender ideology clearly thinks there's really nothing natural at all in human relations, or at least in sexual relations. You know, it's all culture, all the way down, even to the point that there's no such thing as biology, really. We can just kind of construct it any way we like. There can be 7 sexes or 2, 72 genders or none. You know, it's all done with words. Okay, so forget that. That's clearly crazy. But what do the other two say? What does radical feminism say? Well, I think radical feminism clearly says there is nature, we are natural, there's sexual dimorphism, we're differently built, different reproductive capacities. But I think they think that we should be suspicious of the natural because it's dangerous for women. So natural difference produces a hostile environment for females, I think they think. You know, it basically makes us susceptible to being raped, to being carried off, to being assaulted. And so we must, the kind of activist element would be to alter culture to protect women from men. But the danger came from the biology, as it were, and now we need to kind of tame men into like not exploiting us, and we need to set up institutions that prevent our labor from being exploited and stuff like that. So the emphasis towards nature is essentially suspicious. But this other kind of feminism, which I forgot to tell you, they call reactionary feminism. Basically, Mary Harrington would call herself a reactionary feminist. I think they think culture is the thing that's suspicious. Technology is suspicious. The pill has messed us up. Abortion has messed us up. Like, we need to, I think they essentially think nature is more benign, and that there's something kind of more nurturing and natural, and the closer we get to nature, sort of the better relationships between men and women will be. So if that's right, and I haven't run it by them, but you know, if that's right, that's a really different framing of the nature-culture split. And I guess because a lot of the reactionary feminists are theists, I guess it would fit with a kind of, if you're a theist, if you think God created nature, I guess you're more likely to think that it's basically okay. If you think there's no God, the world is just this feral, savage place where males aggress females, then you're more likely to think of nature as something we have to tame and be frightened of. So that's my kind of, I don't know what you call it, kind of open-minded kind of critique. I'm trying to think through like what is going on here, and that's as far as I've got. But I will stop there. Thank you very much. Oh, okay. So I'm gonna chair questions if there are any. Yes.
Hi, Kathleen. I'm a student at the University of Warwick, where we recently, I think about a year ago now, we hosted Nadeem Zahawi to kind of huge protest from students. But this wasn't actually on account of the Tories' record in government or anything about austerity, but on account that he dared to endorse one of your transphobic, apparently, views, thus meaning that his very presence on campus was apparently causing mental distress, and therefore these trans people kind of owed mitigating circumstances in exams, is what I believe Pride argued. But that being said, and I hope this isn't against the rules, but I've got a question from my mum, because she's a huge fan and she's bought your book, and she asks, do you think that the increase in adolescents identifying as the opposite sex is explained by Erikson's theory of normal development in adolescence?
Erikson's theory of what? Sorry?
Normal development in adolescence.
I'm afraid your mum is going to have to tell me what that is.
I'll try and get the explainer there very briefly. Lemon how. Not sure why she asked such a complex question, but yes. She says where they are seeking identity / belonging versus role confusion, and it is actually that because gender roles are harder to define nowadays.
I didn't hear any of that. You have to say it more slowly.
Where they are, where adolescents are seeking identity / belonging versus role confusion, and it's actually that because gender roles are harder to define nowadays. So basically, teens seeking belonging in identity groups.
That seems like a deep theory of psychology that I just amn't that qualified to talk about. So I think what I do think is it's probably what they call multifactorial, why so many adolescents are identifying out of their sex or having some kind of gender confusion. And I think social media is something to do with it. I think there's a general mental health crisis in adolescence, and it's getting expressed through body hatred. And that's not new. That in itself is not new. There's obviously been waves of anorexia and self-harming going through teenage girl populations for a while. But this is a new way of expressing that. That's all I could really say.
Thank you.
Yes.
You said feminism is for women and girls. That was like an exact
quote. Yeah, I think so, yeah.
I'm just curious, can a guy even be a feminist?
I feel like there's a lot of heat expended on that question.
In your opinion,
yeah,
this is a place for free speech.
It's not that I'm hedging because I'm scared to say what I think. It's just I think, well, it depends what you mean by feminism. I think guys can be feminist adjacent. You know what I mean? They can clearly think that the interests and the well-being of women and girls is a good thing. Why not? I mean, I would be interested in that if I was a man. And then you're going to have different arguments about how that cashes out. And what I also don't agree with is the idea that only women can talk about what womanhood is. That seems crazy to me, because it's a description. I just don't understand why men couldn't have something to say about that. Now, of course, they might be wrong, but there is this kind of authoritarianism within feminism that says you can't even speak about it, and that seems bad. Yes.
Hello, I'm Wilson. He, him. Just kidding. What else? Once we get through this time, what else is there for feminism to do? Once we get back to like a constructive project.
Well, I think there's too much emphasis. There's been too much emphasis in liberal feminism on sort of what British people would say middle class, but I think like bourgeois, like university educated women. And obviously, I think the intersection of being poor and being female is one that produces more problems for women in that group, and that we don't pay much attention to things like socioeconomic factors there or class as well. So there's a lot of emphasis on relatively peripheral issues, I think. And I think we should triage and look at like sexual violence, for instance, more intensely. I mean, you can barely get convicted of rape in the UK anymore. It's just become really very difficult to prosecute rape. And yet, I don't think rape has gone down. So the stuff like that I think is really crucial to look at and not mess around with language and pronouns. Okay, I feel like I'm doing this badly. So yes, you, then you, and then I'm going to move over here.
Hi, my name is Andrew. Thanks so much for speaking with us. So many people have already undergone sexual changes, transitions with their bodies and have made this change. How are we supposed to kind of deal with that nowadays? Unless like we can't just like put the genie back in the bottle.
No,
like
I agree.
This is out. Like, how are we supposed to kind of deal with this? What is the way to approach this topic now that this has occurred? Like,
well, with extreme sensitivity, I think. So, although I'm quite bullish when I talk in venues like this in the general, I'm not going to go up to trans people and tell them, I'm not going to go up to a trans woman and go, you're a man, I don't do that. And I'm happy actually to observe preferred pronouns and to immerse myself in the fiction sometimes for certain purposes, although I'm not going to do it if it's a guy in a swimming pool beating all the women. I think there's times when we have to pay attention to reality and there's times when we can be more flexible. But ultimately, the idea, one of the things I like about the kind of gender-critical attitude to this, that is thinking that there are some things about masculinity and femininity we should try and change. Why can't we open up the idea of what it is to be a man that incorporates some femininity, but doesn't change their status? It doesn't make you a woman if you're a feminine man, basically. It doesn't make you a man if you're a masculine woman. We could be more open-minded about kind of, ironically, we could be more non-binary about those things. So that's one thing I think we can do. The other thing we really, really need to do is attend to the plight of detransitioners, because many people are suffering because they had surgeries or took drugs prematurely and have made changes to their body that they can't take back. And they are pushed out of their own community, they're pushed out of the trans community, and then the non-trans community don't really know how to deal with that either. So that's urgent, I think. Yes, over here we've got some people.
Hi, I'm Dan. We met just a moment ago.
Hi.
Thank you so much for speaking in front of us. I want to push back a little bit on that last point you made, and I'm sorry if my ideas aren't so clear because I'm on the spot. But we're kind of talking about the effectiveness, let's say, of masculinity and femininity in men on the front of pushing for women's rights, let's say. Could it not be possible that both play a role in helping, but for different reasons? And to the extent that we want to promote progress, it might be dangerous to force one position over the other at the risk of losing the benefits from the other.
So what am I, just to clarify, so I understand you right, do you think I might be forcing?
I guess I don't think it, but I fear, that risk, that if we talk too much in favor of one.
In favor of one what, sorry?
Oh, sorry, one approach being masculinity or femininity, that we might confuse a whole group of people into believing, you have a binary decision. And I just want to add really quickly.
Oh no, that was not what I had in mind at all.
Okay.
I mean, there's many ways to be a man, very masculine, somewhat feminine. It's all fine. I think that's all fine. It depends obviously what do we mean by masculine and feminine? But, obviously there are different body shapes. People have done different things to themselves surgically now, and there's different ways to dress. I don't think there's any worry about any of that myself. I'm not someone who insists on very binary ways of being at all. I'm saying it doesn't make you a woman if you're a male who's got breasts and wears a dress. I think we can't shift the categories to that extent because chaos then reigns.
Yeah, I'm in absolute agreement with you
Okay.
on that. And I just wanted to state, in case I was not clear, wherever there might be issues, I think humility is probably the best way to solve those and to get people to work together. And so I appreciate the humility that you've actually demonstrated over the course of your career and
thank you.
especially in the public limelight.
Thank you.
Yep.
Hi, Kathleen. My name is Javier. Very nice to meet you.
Hiya.
One thing about gender ideology that I guess has annoyed me for some time has been when gender ideology all of a sudden came into the non-English field in which now we have to address Hispanics or Latinos as Latinx. I'd rather die than be called Latinx. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
Yes, I do. It's a kind of colonization, and it really annoys me that the people that preach the most about decolonizing the curriculum then import this entirely Western way of looking at things and sell it back to nations that have had very complicated kind of attitudes towards gender fluidity for quite often, but their own ways of thinking about it. So yeah, it really annoys me. And it's actually, you know, it's not just funny. It's like big liberal foundations are giving grants to poorer nations with conditions built in that they go along with this stuff. You know, and because it has captured feminism, women's organizations are insisting they will only give money if men can come into this shelter or this, you know, it's terrible.
Hello, my name is Thomas. Thank you so much for speaking with us. I'm sure that you've seen the political firestorm with Ron DeSantis' so-called "Don't Say Gay" law. So my question for you is, what do you think should be the role of education in teaching like LGBT curriculum, be that anything involving like transgenderism or even just like LGBT relationships? I don't think it's a good idea to go back to the idea to just not talking about sexuality at all in school. I think there's basic facts that kids need to know at an age where they can deal with it, and that's probably around adolescence. So they need to know the basic facts of life, reproductive facts. They need to know there are gay people. And I'm not really sure what else they need to know, actually, than that. I mean, this whole kind of shitstorm that's emerging out of this is terrible for gay people and lesbians, in my view, because we are being kind of pushed together into this massive rainbow mess with all these extra categories. And then we are used kind of strategically to kind of cement it all together and make it look kind of progressive. But actually, it's not in my name that kids are being told that they can change sex. I think that's a terrible thing to tell children who barely understand what femaleness and maleness is in the first place before some teacher is messing them up about it. So yeah, it's a mess.
Thank you for speaking with us today. I asked this question not quizzically, but genuinely curious. Outside of the context of transgenderism and within the context of the developed Western world, what further ground does the feminist movement need to cover with respect to men in society?
Well, legally, I mean, I don't know the laws in every country. So, I mean, there are some countries which don't have any sex-based protections in law at all. And then I guess in the States, I mean, as far as I understand it, you have got sex-based protections, but there's all this other stuff like gender identity is being pushed in and mixed up with sex, which means it's very hard to establish sexual discrimination precedents sometimes, because there might be a male who says she's a woman, and then that's going to mess up your understanding of who was discriminated against and for what reason. So I think the law needs to be clarified. So that is an urgent task for feminism. There's a new task now, because all the lobbyists are saying you need to put sex and gender identity together in law, and actually we need to pull them apart. Sex is sex, gender identity is gender identity. You can then have a discussion about whether you want to protect gender identity or something else, but you definitely need to protect sex, because it is the basis on which discrimination happens and violence happens, and we need to be able to talk about that, I think. So that's one. There's plenty of parts of the world in which women have no rights whatsoever. And maybe we should, I don't know, it's very difficult, because like as a Western feminist, I'm not going to steam into Saudi Arabia and tell people how to live their lives. But, I think what's going on with women in some countries is disgusting. And that is a task for feminism in some sense, even just to maybe communicate with feminists in those countries and find out what we could do.
this question is a follow-up on something you just said, specific to foundations, individuals that may be behind lobbying for this narrative. As a student, I'm curious, how have these individuals or organizations or sources of finance been so successful in systematically infiltrating American or Western universities in such a short period of time?
Well, I don't know about America, but I can tell you how they did it in Britain, and it may be similar. They got in through HR departments. There's an organization called Stonewall that was very successful in lobbying for gay rights and got, very instrumental in bringing in gay marriage. But they have these schemes that employers can join. They have a kind of award ceremony, like it's called the Equality Index, and you can go up or down in the Equality Index, and employers vie to be up at the top. And so once you join those schemes, Stonewall just starts churning out propaganda saying trans women are women, you need to tell all your employees they need to put their pronouns in their signatures, you need to change all the bathrooms, they're just giving them instructions about how to change all this and kind of telling them that it's sort of is the law already, but maybe we're going a bit ahead of the law because we're progressive. And the employers don't know any different. They're just saying, okay, we'll do this. And they've been doing that for about 10 years. So it just got in everywhere. Universities are members of Stonewall schemes, schools are, government departments, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the BBC, the Guardian, they are all instructed by Stonewall. And now they're starting to withdraw a bit because there's so much pressure on them, but that's how it happened. I've got only one more question, so I'm going to say lady in the white.
My name's Ella, and Wellesley is a women's college, and I guess I could give a story on the admissions policies and the decisions that are being made on that right now, or you could read it in the New York Times. But essentially, I guess I'm wondering if you still believe that there is a role for women's colleges in the modern day, and I will not be hurt by your answer if it is.
I never went to one. But I am open to the idea that there are space. Yeah, I definitely think women, for some contexts, need spaces away from men. The bit that's controversial is I think also men need spaces away from women. And not many feminists will say that. But because we're different. And sometimes we just need to be amongst our own people for a bit. So I guess a college could work fine. If it is a women's only college, then it shouldn't have men in it. That's what I think. I mean, that kind of destroys the point. So I think we're done. Right, okay.